came earlier than expected, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the quiet of the house like a blade. I had barely rolled out of bed, still wrapped in the remnants of half-forgotten dreams, and yet here it was. This sound that didn't belong, this interruption that sent a ripple through the stillness of the morning. I tightened my robe around me, my fingers gripping the fabric as I hesitated for just a second too long. I already knew who it was. That knowledge sat heavy in my stomach like a swallowed stone. But knowing didn't make facing it any easier. With a breath I didn't quite believe in, I turned the knob and opened the door. And there he was. Standing just beyond the threshold, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, that same easy confidence hanging off him like a well-worn jacket. He hadn't changed much, not in the way that counted. The sharp jawline, the knowing smirk, the eyes that had always seen too much. He looked like he belonged here, like no time had passed at all, like the years hadn't stretched between us, thick and silent with everything we never said. But they had. And the sight of him standing here in my doorway in our house made my stomach tighten with something I couldn't name. "Didn't think I'd see you again," I said, my voice coming out more controlled than I expected, even as my pulse drummed wildly in my throat. "You say that like you're not the one who left first," he replied smoothly, stepping past me before I had the chance to decide if I even wanted him to. His presence was too easy, too familiar, and yet completely foreign all at once. The scent of worn leather and faint cologne trailed behind him as he moved deeper inside, his gaze sweeping the space like he was cataloging the changes, the little details that made this place different from the last time he had been here. I closed the door slowly, as if that could somehow slow the way the past was rushing back into the present. From the kitchen, my husband's voice floated into the hallway, casual and unsuspecting, completely unaware of the shift that had just occurred. He had left the TV on, the soft hum of morning news blending with the clinking of his coffee mug against the counter. Everything normal. Everything as it should be. Except it wasn't. Not anymore. I turned just in time to see my husband walk into the room, mug in one hand, phone in the other, looking up only when the movement caught his eye. For a brief moment something flickered across his face. Something unreadable, something caught between surprise and wariness, but it disappeared just as quickly as it came. He set his mug down with a quiet clink, straightened his shoulders. "You're early," he said, the words polite, but there was something else beneath them, something I couldn't quite place. "Figured I'd beat the traffic." The reply came easy, effortless, a perfectly practiced lie slipping between them like a handshake. The tension in the room was subtle but present, threading through the air, thick enough that I could almost touch it. I stayed silent. I didn't trust my voice. The two of them stood there, facing each other, the gap between them filled with something invisible but heavy. My husband was still, composed as ever, but I saw it. The tightness in his jaw, the way his grip on the countertop hardened ever so slightly. And the other one, the one who had just arrived, he was watching too, his expression calm, amused even, as if he was in on a joke no one else could hear. "You must be tired," my husband finally said, the words clipped, controlled, a subtle dismissal wrapped in politeness. "A little," was the answer, a slow nod following. "But I'm sure I'll get comfortable soon enough." Pause. One that lasted just a second too long. I exhaled, but it did nothing to ease the feeling pressing down on my chest. This moment. This morning. The shift in the air that I couldn't quite define. Something had changed. And I knew with an unsettling certainty that nothing in this house would ever feel the same again. The days started slipping into a pattern I hadn't anticipated. A rhythm that felt too natural, too easy, as if he had always been here. My husband was buried in work, leaving early, coming home late, his absence turning into the backdrop of my daily routine. And then there was him. Always present, always near, moving through the house like he belonged, filling the spaces my husband left behind. At first I ignored it, dismissed the way he lingered in the kitchen a little too long after breakfast, the way his eyes followed me when he thought I wasn't looking, the way he seemed to be studying me as if memorizing every detail. But then came the small touches, so subtle they could have been accidents, but they weren't. His fingers grazing my wrist when handing me a coffee mug. The light brush of his arm against mine when we stood too close in the hallway. The way his hand found the small of my back just for a second as I moved past him. It was nothing. It was everything. One afternoon we decided to walk to a cafe a few blocks away. A simple excuse to step outside, to break the unspoken tension building between us. The air was crisp, the sidewalks buzzing with life, but I felt out of sync, like I was walking through a scene I wasn't supposed to be part of. He walked beside me, hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed, but his presence was charged, drawing me in even as I fought against it. We stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, and that's when he turned to me, eyes sharp, unreadable. "You're not as happy as you pretend to be," he said, his voice low, even, but there was something beneath it, something dangerous. My breath caught for half a second, just enough for him to notice. I forced out a small laugh, shaking my head, but it felt unnatural, like a cheap defense. "That's ridiculous," I said, but it didn't come out as convincingly as I'd hoped. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. He just looked at me, letting the silence stretch, waiting for me to fill it. I wanted to walk away, to change the subject, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was, he wasn't. The rest of the walk was quiet, but my mind wasn't. His words echoed, weaving into thoughts I shouldn't have been entertaining, pulling at something I had buried long ago. I reminded myself that this was just my mind playing tricks on me, that this tension was nothing more than nostalgia mixed with circumstance. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, his back turned to me, his breathing deep and steady in sleep, I stared at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something had already shifted. The house was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, an absence filling the space where my husband should have been, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the clock on the wall. He had called an hour ago, something about a last-minute meeting, about not waiting up, about work that never seemed to end. I had nodded along, pretending not to notice how easy it had become for him to miss our evenings together. Now it was just the two of us, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, the dim glow of the pendant light casting soft shadows between us. The tea in my mug had gone cold, untouched, but I held on to it anyway, as if it could ground me, as if it could steady the strange, weightless feeling that had settled over the room. He was watching me. He had been watching me all night, his gaze unrelenting, studying every flicker of hesitation, every unspoken thought. I could feel it like static against my skin, a pressure I didn't know how to shake. I met his eyes for a second too long, and that was all he needed. "You know," he said, his voice calm, deliberate, threading through the silence like something tangible, "it never really stopped." I swallowed hard, unsure if I wanted to ask what he meant, unsure if I wanted to hear the answer. But he didn't leave space for doubt. "You know, don't you?" His fingers tapped lightly against his mug, his posture deceptively relaxed, but his voice carried weight, something unshakable. "It never stopped for me." My throat tightened, words failing before they could form. There were 100 ways I could have answered, 100 ways I could have pretended I didn't understand. But none of them would have mattered, because the moment had already shifted, the air between us thick with something undeniable, something dangerous. Before I could think, before I could stop it, he moved. It wasn't hesitant, it wasn't careful. It was deliberate, inevitable, like a decision that had already been made long before either of us admitted it. His hand brushed against my cheek, fingers barely skimming my skin, and then his lips were on mine. Soft, firm, familiar in a way that sent a shock through my entire body. It lasted only a second, maybe two, just enough for reality to fracture, just enough for everything I thought I knew to tilt on its axis. Then it was over. He pulled back, his breath warm against my lips, his eyes searching mine for something, but I didn't know what. My heart pounded, the room spinning, the weight of what had just happened crashing down all at once. I should have said something. I should have stopped it before it started. But all I could do was sit there, staring at him, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. I told myself it was nothing, that it was a mistake, that it would never happen again. I repeated it in my head like a mantra, convincing myself that I had imagined the weight of it, the way the world had tilted for those few stolen seconds. It was a lapse in judgment, a moment of weakness, a flicker of something that had no place in my life. I was still me. I was still in control. And yet, no matter how many times I said it, my hands still trembled when I poured my morning coffee, my breath still caught when I walked into a room and saw him there, my body still braced for something unseen every time he moved too close. I avoided his gaze, pretended not to notice the way his eyes lingered on me, the way his presence filled the space between us with something unspoken and impossible to ignore. But avoidance wasn't enough. It was never enough. The tension clung to the air like humidity before a storm, thick and suffocating, pressing in with every passing day. My husband didn't notice the change, not fully, not yet, but he sensed it in the way I hesitated before answering his questions, in the way I drifted through the house as if my mind was somewhere else. He was too busy to question it outright, too preoccupied with meetings and deadlines and the constant weight of his responsibilities. But he wasn't oblivious. One evening, as he loosened his tie and settled onto the couch, he glanced at me with something unreadable in his eyes and asked if I wanted to go out for dinner, just the two of us like old times. A pause stretched between us and I could feel the moment hanging there, waiting for me to grab hold of it, to say yes, to push everything else away and step back into the life I had built. But instead I forced a tight smile and told him I had things to do, emails to catch up on, errands to run. He nodded, not pushing, but there was something in his expression, something almost resigned, as if he had expected the answer before I even gave it. I watched him retreat to his office, watched the door close behind him, and felt the weight of my own silence pressing against my chest. By the time evening settled over the house, I was alone again. Or at least I told myself I was. But I knew better. I felt it before I even heard him, before his voice slid through the quiet like a blade against silk. "You really think you can just forget?" I turned too quickly, pulse spiking, hands clenching at my sides as if bracing for impact. He was leaning against the counter, watching me with that same calm certainty, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. The same look he had given me the night everything changed. I opened my mouth to protest, to say something sharp, something final, something that would cut through whatever this was before it had the chance to spread. But the words never came. Because the truth was, I didn't know how to forget. And worse than that, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The guilt clung to me like a second skin, heavy and suffocating, wrapping around every thought, every breath, every moment I spent pretending nothing had changed. I told myself I could fix this, that I could undo the fracture forming between me and the life I had chosen. So I did what any rational wife would do. I tried to reclaim what was mine. I spent the afternoon preparing dinner, setting the table with candles, arranging everything perfectly, as if aesthetics alone could repair what had been slowly unraveling. When my husband walked through the door, his eyes widened in surprise, a slow smile stretching across his face as he loosened his tie, the weight of his day fading as he took in the scene before him. He pulled me into an embrace, warm and familiar, pressing a lingering kiss to my temple, whispering that this was exactly what he needed. We ate, we talked, we laughed in a way we hadn't in months, and for a moment I almost believed in the illusion I was trying to create. But underneath the laughter, underneath his affectionate glances, my mind was elsewhere, trapped in memories I didn't ask for, in a tension I was desperately trying to erase. When he reached for me, when his lips found mine, I kissed him back with an urgency that startled even me. His touch was familiar, comforting, a reminder of the life we had built, but deep inside I knew this wasn't about love. This was about drowning out the thoughts I shouldn't be having, about proving to myself that I still belonged here, that I still belonged to him. I barely registered the movement behind me, the shift in the air, the presence lingering just out of sight. But when I pulled away, my eyes flickered past my husband's shoulder, and there he was, watching. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't react in any way except for the tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers curled into fists at his sides. His expression was unreadable, but something in his gaze was colder than before, sharper, like a silent warning. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, and for the first time, I felt like I had lost control of something I didn't even understand. I told myself it was over, that whatever had been simmering between us had been extinguished the moment he saw me in my husband's arms. I told myself that his silence in the days that followed was proof, that he had accepted the boundary I had drawn between us. But the truth was, there was no boundary, not anymore. And if there was, I was the one testing it, leaning too close to the edge, waiting to see how far I could go before it crumbled completely. I started noticing him in ways I shouldn't have, catching glimpses of him when he wasn't looking, lingering in the spaces where I knew he would be. My heart kicked every time I heard him move through the house. My pulse quickened whenever his gaze brushed over me, heavy and knowing. It was a game, one I hadn't agreed to play, but one I couldn't seem to stop. The smallest moments felt electrified. The way our hands would brush as we passed in the hallway, the way his eyes lingered just a second too long when I walked into a room, the way he'd say my name like it meant something more than it should. Then my husband left. Another trip, another few days alone in the house with him, another stretch of time filled with possibility and danger. The first night I told myself I would keep my distance, that I wouldn't let the quiet between us turn into something else. But the house was too empty, the air too charged, and before I knew it I was standing in the kitchen pouring a glass of wine, knowing he was in the next room, knowing he could walk in at any second. And then he did. He leaned against the doorway watching me, his expression unreadable, but the silence between us was louder than words. He didn't have to say anything. I knew what he was thinking because I was thinking it too. I don't know who moved first, only that suddenly we were too close, that the space between us had vanished, that my breath hitched as I felt the heat of him radiating inches away. His hand lifted, his fingers brushing against my arm, barely touching, but my skin burned beneath the weight of it. My heart pounded so hard I thought he might hear it, but he didn't pull away. He just watched me, waiting, testing, daring me to be the one to stop it. And I almost didn't. I almost let him close the last bit of space between us, almost let myself fall. But I did stop it. Just before the moment could tip into something irreversible, I stepped back, breaking the contact, the air rushing between us like a snapped wire. I didn't look at him as I turned and walked away, didn't let myself see whatever was in his eyes, because if I did, I knew I wouldn't be able to leave. I locked myself in my room, my pulse still racing, my body still humming from something that hadn't even happened. I told myself I had done the right thing, that I had stopped it before it could start. But that night I woke up in the dark, my body restless, my mind tangled in thoughts I shouldn't be having. And I knew, this wasn't over. The air inside the house felt different now, heavier, like the walls had absorbed the tension between us and were pressing it back into the space we shared. He had stopped pretending, stopped hiding the way his eyes followed me, how his presence shifted when I was near. He didn't touch me, not really, not in any way that could be called an accident anymore, but there was something just as dangerous in the way he looked at me. It was an invitation, a silent dare, a waiting game that I was losing with every passing day. He never pushed, never crossed the invisible line, but he stayed close enough to make sure I knew it was there, to make sure I knew that if I took one step, just one, he wouldn't stop me. And that was worse than if he had tried to take it himself. I tried to act normal, to move through the house like everything was the same, but I felt him watching, always watching, his presence wrapping around me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I started avoiding empty rooms, avoiding being alone with him too long, but it didn't matter because the tension followed us everywhere, seeping into the space between words, into glances held too long, into the silence that used to be comfortable but now felt suffocating. And then one night we left the house. We were inside something else, something separate, something dangerous. And then, without warning, he reached for my hand. His fingers wrapped around my wrist, firm but not forceful, a touch that sent a sharp jolt through my body, freezing me mid-step. I turned to him, but his gaze was already there, dark, steady, filled with something I didn't have the strength to name. "Just say no and I'll stop," he said, his voice calm, controlled, but there was something beneath it, something taut, waiting to snap. I should have said it. It would have been so easy. Just one word. One breath. One decision. But my mouth wouldn't form the sound, my voice caught somewhere deep inside me, tangled up in everything I wasn't ready to admit. I didn't say it. He exhaled slowly, his fingers lingering for a second longer before he let go, but the damage was done. Something had shifted again, another wall cracked, another step too close to the edge. I turned away, kept walking, but the feeling of his hand on me stayed, burned into my skin, into my mind, into every thought I tried to suppress. By the time we reached the building, the street was empty, the world around us dark and quiet. The stairwell was dim, only a single flickering light above, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. I hesitated at the door, but he didn't. He stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate, giving me time, giving me space, but I didn't take it. I felt the warmth of him, the way the air between us vibrated with everything unspoken. His hand lifted, barely touching, fingertips brushing the side of my jaw. His breath was warm against my skin, his lips close enough that I could feel the whisper of them without contact. One more inch, one more second, and everything would change. And then I pulled away. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sharp or sudden. It was a slow step backward, a retreat, a breath that finally broke the spell. I didn't look at him, didn't say anything, just turned and walked inside, closing the door between us before I could change my mind. I leaned against it, my heartbeat hammering, my hands shaking, my body betraying every lie I had told myself. Because for the first time I realized the truth. I wasn't afraid of him. I was afraid of myself. The house was still, wrapped in the quiet of the night, the kind of silence that should have been soothing but instead felt like the calm before a storm. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through everything that had happened, everything I had tried to bury, but it wouldn't stay buried, not anymore. The tension between us had built up to a point where it could no longer be ignored. I heard him before I saw him. The soft tread of his footsteps down the hallway, the subtle creak of the floorboards beneath his weight. I didn't turn to look, but I felt him near, felt the shift in the air and knew what was coming. I knew that this time I wouldn't be able to stop it. The door creaked open slowly and there he was, standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light from the hallway. His gaze locked with mine, no words, just an understanding, a silent agreement that the space between us had finally been crossed. He moved toward me with the same calm precision he always had, but this time there was something more. Something darker in the way he approached, something that made my pulse race even faster. I tried to pull away, tried to find some semblance of control, but I was already past the point of no return. The distance between us disappeared in an instant as his hand cupped my face, his thumb brushing over my lips, sending a shiver down my spine. And then without hesitation he kissed me. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't tender. It was a kiss fueled by everything we had hidden, everything we had denied. It was hungry, desperate, as if we both knew that once we started we couldn't stop. I kissed him back with a force that shocked me, my hands finding their way to his chest, pulling him closer, feeling the heat of his body against mine, as if the only thing that mattered in that moment was the contact, the closeness, the breaking of every boundary that had once seemed so firm. The kiss deepened, became more frantic, as if we were both trying to prove something to each other, to ourselves. And then just as quickly as it had started there was a sound. The door creaking again. I pulled away, my breath shallow, my heart racing, and there he stood. My husband. He didn't shout. He didn't demand answers. There was nothing dramatic, no angry confrontation, no accusations. Instead his gaze met mine and in that instant I saw it. The disappointment. The hurt. The quiet devastation in his eyes was enough to crush me, enough to send a ripple of guilt coursing through my veins. He stood there in the doorway watching us, his face hardening, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. The man I had once promised everything to, the man I had built my life with, was looking at me and I couldn't find the strength to meet his eyes. But it wasn't just me who was caught in that moment. His brother stood there too, unflinching, his expression unreadable. He didn't move. He didn't try to explain or apologize or make any attempt to undo what had just happened. He simply looked at my husband, his gaze steady and almost too calm, as if he had already known this moment would come. And as the silence stretched on, the weight of the realization settled in. This was the moment when everything changed. This was the moment when there was no going back. And in that stillness nothing else needed to be said. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavier than anything I had ever felt before. I stood there in the doorway, unable to move, my mind racing with 1,000 explanations I couldn't find the words for, my heart pounding in my chest as I searched for something to say, something that might undo what had just unfolded. My husband didn't speak at first, his gaze fixed on me, cold and distant as if I were a stranger. His eyes, which had once held warmth and affection, now reflected nothing but disappointment, a look that made the room feel even smaller, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. He didn't raise his voice, didn't ask why or demand answers. He simply looked at me, his silence more damning than any accusation. I opened my mouth, but the words didn't come. I wanted to say that it was a mistake, that it didn't mean anything, that I was still the person he thought I was, but those words felt hollow even to me. They couldn't erase what had happened. They couldn't undo the damage that was already done. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he turned away, his back to me as he gathered his things, as if the conversation was already over, as if he had already made up his mind. Without a word, he walked out the door, leaving me standing there in the silence, the echo of his departure ringing in my ears. I didn't even try to stop him. I couldn't. The next morning, the house was emptier than it had ever been. He was gone and I was left alone with my thoughts, my guilt, and the heavy realization that everything had changed. The sound of the front door opening startled me, pulling me from my thoughts. I turned to see him standing there, my husband's brother standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. For a moment neither of us said anything. He just looked at me, his eyes reflecting something darker now, something that hadn't been there before. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, the door clicking shut behind him, sealing us both in this tense, suffocating moment. I thought for a second that he might say something, that he might apologize or explain himself, but instead he just looked at me with that same cold, almost amused expression. He was already leaving. He had already decided to go just like my husband had, but before he did he spoke, his voice calm, almost too calm. "You knew this was wrong," he said, his gaze never leaving mine. "But you wanted it. You wanted it more than anything." His words stung, and for a moment I wanted to shout, to deny it, to say I hadn't wanted any of this, but I couldn't. I couldn't lie to him, not when his words hit so close to the truth. He was right. I had wanted it. I had let it happen. And now, standing in front of me, he was a reminder of everything I had lost, of everything I had chosen to ignore. Without another word, he grabbed his bag and turned toward the door. "Goodbye," he said, and in that moment, it felt like the world was collapsing around me. The door closed behind him and I was left standing in the silence, once again alone. I looked around the house, but it didn't feel like home anymore. The rooms, once filled with warmth, now felt cold, empty, haunted by the weight of my decisions. The walls that had once been a comfort now felt suffocating, closing in around me as if the house itself was rejecting me. I had destroyed everything. I had pushed everything away. And now I had nothing. Weeks passed, each day blending into the next, each moment marked by the absence of what had once been, a space that could not be filled. The house was quieter now, emptier, as if the walls themselves had begun to mourn. My husband hadn't returned to the life we had once shared. He had gone, physically and emotionally, and there was no sign, no word, no gesture to suggest that he might ever want to return. His presence in the house had become a distant memory, a shadow that I could still feel but could no longer touch. He had chosen his silence over any kind of reconciliation, and I, trapped in my own guilt, knew that I had no right to ask for more. He had already made his decision. And then there was him, my brother-in-law, who had disappeared from my life as quickly as he had entered it. The familiar weight of his gaze was no longer there, his presence no longer slipped in between the cracks of my everyday life. It was as if he had never been there at all. I couldn't even convince myself that I missed him. Because what was there to miss? The fleeting moments we had shared, the intense, confusing desire, had been nothing more than a distraction, a lie I had told myself, a dangerous game that I was now paying the price for. I looked at myself in the mirror every day, but the woman who stared back at me wasn't the one I had known. She wasn't the woman who had promised to build a life with my husband, to create something stable, something solid. No, the reflection I saw now was a stranger. Someone who had destroyed everything she had ever wanted for the sake of a moment of passion. The guilt was suffocating, but I couldn't stop looking. I couldn't stop reminding myself of the choices I had made, the lines I had crossed. There was no forgiveness, no redemption, not yet. I was left with nothing but the consequences of my actions. I found myself sitting alone in a cafe one afternoon, the familiar hum of the city outside doing little to calm the storm inside my head. I watched people walk by, their lives moving on, unaffected by the wreckage that had become mine. For a moment I thought I saw him, the figure in the crowd who moved like he was familiar, like he belonged. My heart skipped, a foolish hope rising in me, and for a fleeting second, I was sure I had found a way out of this emptiness. But as the figure passed by, the illusion shattered. It wasn't him. It was just another stranger, another face in the crowd. The moment slipped away and I was left with nothing but the cold reality of the empty chair across from me. I realized then that I was alone, and the truth settled in deeper than ever before. There was no way back. There was no undoing what had been done. The roads that had once led to something familiar were now closed off, and I was standing at the end of them with no path to follow. The future felt like a vast emptiness, and all I could do was sit there watching life pass me by, knowing that the decisions I had made would be the ones